My mom stole thousands from me and opened credit cards in my name. Growing up, my mom was always in and out of jail for stealing. Last time she was arrested was in 2015. I was 19 at that time. She always said she stole to provide for our family, but we never lived in a stable home. She would just blow money on expensive gifts and tell us we aren't poor, we have this, how many poor kids have this? As we lived from hotel to hotel. Growing up, I became the financially responsible child. I worked multiple jobs, got good grades, and community service. I was able to save up $8,500 for college with multiple scholarships. During my hard work in high school, I also helped my mom with bills and paying for whatever she needed help with. When I left for college, she was arrested again and had to be dropped off states away by my aunt for my first day of college. I asked my mom for my college money and she said would transfer the money when she got out. When she got out, it all magically disappeared. She blamed my dead grandmother for stealing my money. In 2019, I discovered multiple credit cards and an apartment late on bills were opened in my name. I cried to my mom about all these issues and she comforted me and asked for more money. I gave her more money. I graduated with my BA and went to grad school. I was able to be in grad school for 1 year with my savings before I needed to take grad plus loans out. I applied but was denied due to all the negative items on my credit score. My mom told me to just pay it off. I didn't, I dropped out instead. I was devastated, but I wasn't going to pay for other people's fun ride. I called all the credit companies and got the address for all the credit cards. It was my mom's address. When confronted, she broke down saying it was my grandmother and how dare I blame her for this. She demanded an apology and didn't speak to me for a week. My grandmother died before all the credit cards were open. I filed a police report against my mother. She doesn't know yet, but when she finds out, I am sure I will receive the best kind of text message.
If my husband's mistress shows up at his funeral, how should I respond? Do I ignore her, pretend, or look the other way? This is an odd story of mine, life-changing at the time. My mother was involved with a man when I was 11, my parents having divorced a year or so earlier. My siblings and I liked him. He was friendly and patient and really seemed to like us. He had 2 children of his own, younger than me, that I had never met. We knew he was married to someone else, but theoretically was in the process of getting a divorce. From our point of view, he lived in the basement of his house, which was about 5 miles away from our house. We had started getting thinly veiled threats from the wife in various ways: fire department showing up to rescue us from imaginary house fires, the wife showing up on our doorstep asking if we had her dog, weird phone calls, stuff like that. One day, he and my mom were getting ready to leave to go somewhere. He counted out about $200 on the table in front of me, and told me he was going to give it to his wife for child support. They left, and about 2 hours or so later my mom came back in his car, hysterical. She crying that his wife had shot him. I tend to be an optimist, so I assumed my mom was overreacting, something had happened, but I was sure it would turn out okay. About an hour after that, a CHP officer showed up at the door. He was a friend, our next door neighbor from our old neighborhood. He stepped in and just said to my mom, he didn't make it, and then we were all crying. The next few months were so dark, and the wife was arrested and being held in the county jail, but a funeral was planned. My mom wanted to go, though this did not seem like a good idea. And she went. Unfortunately, the deputies also brought the wife, in handcuffs. As soon as she saw my mom, she went off, screaming about how that beach shouldn't be there. Yelling a lot. The authorities thought it better that my mom leave, and asked her to wait in another room. After the funeral, they brought her in for a private viewing, where she was able to cry alone with the body. It meant a lot to her. After so many years, I'm not sure if any of this is altered in my mind. I expect if the mistress shows up she might get screamed at, but I also sort of expect that she might have some reason to be there. Has anyone ever said something to you that resonated like an echo in your head? It was one sentence, and it has stayed with me 30 years and counting. As a young lady, I knew a couple in their 50s, 2 men who had shared many wonderful years together, until one of them had a brain hemorrhage at work one day. Tom was never the same after his hemorrhage. He regressed into a childlike state, perhaps a child of 12. His conversations were superficial and simple, he couldn't sit still, he'd have tantrums, and he had to be supervised for his own safety. He was a lovely guy, and it always felt odd having to talk to a grown man like he's a child. His partner continued to live with him, but of course, any romance was now strictly off the table. It was more of a carer/patient relationship. I watched this partner struggle for years caring for Tom. He suffered from depression, sadness, loneliness. Every time I had a private conversation with him, his exasperated expression would nearly alive me. He desperately wanted his old life back. He wanted freedom, fun, adult conversations and romance. But, to put it bluntly, he was instead trapped in a nightmare, caring for a child. That is not to say there weren't still some good times for him. He had money, lots of friends, he and Tom traveled, and he made the most of life. As they weren't married, and as Tom had family he was very close to, I sometimes wondered why his care hadn't been relinquished to them, or to a care home. I'd seen married people abandon their partner for much less, so why was Tom's partner putting himself through this? One day, I delicately asked him why, expecting he'd just put it down to love. Truth is that love had probably left the building ages ago. The integrity in his answer impacted me greatly, because it's a simple act of fairness rarely demonstrated in some relationships and friendships. Because he would have done the same for me. Have you ever told a ridiculous lie just to see how someone would react? 20 plus years ago I was ordered to lie to my buyer or lose my job. I was ordered by my boss despite my protests. The company I worked for had just won a major contract to sell light globes through one of the largest hardware chains in Australia, Mitre 10. However, we were very much behind schedule, having had a number of delays already. Many times I had been into my buyer to let him know of our latest delay, and his patience was wearing thin and my boss knew it. She asked me to lie and blame the latest delay on an earthquake in Japan, our globes were coming from India, or any other lie I could come up with as long as it wasn't the company's fault, as in it had to be a force majeure. I made an appointment with my buyer and sat across from him and literally told him this: Peter, as you know, our globes are coming from India. The ship left on time and the order was 100% filled and packed in a shipping container. Unfortunately, inside the same container was a cage containing a couple of Bengal tigers. They escaped their cage and have unfortunately ripped or damaged all of the light globe packaging. But we could fix that by having new packaging made and printed here in Australia, except that, also in the same container was an Indian elephant. This elephant also escaped its cage and has trampled all the globes. Not one globe was left intact. The entire shipment was destroyed. She's told you to lie to me, didn't she? He said after listening to me spin this ridiculous lie. He knew full well what was going on. We got on very well, he knew me and what I stood for. We stayed in contact for many years after we both left our respective positions. He knew the position my boss had forced me into. After asking me for a new ADA, he told me to leave. He wasn't happy. But I did what I was ordered to do and did it in a way that kept my reputation intact. I hired a private investigator to scare my husband. I pulled this on my husband, soon to be ex. We had been married for 15 years. I had just given birth to our second child. I knew he wasn't happy about our first child and he let it be known he didn't want the second. Everything was fine until we had kids, then he started doing his own thing and treating me horribly. I was sick with worry, trying to work, and was taking care of the home and children alone. One day, I got a call from a guy who told me that he had a private investigator follow his wife and my husband. He had proof of their affair and his evidence fit. I believed him. After a long talk, he said that he wanted to save his marriage and asked what he could do to break them up. I told him, simple. My soon-to-be ex, I knew I was done at this point, is a big coward. You just need to call him and scare him, he said. I can do better than that. This guy was a building contractor. He loaded a bunch of his biggest guys on his crew in his truck and they were waiting to catch my ex at his favorite hangout. He flew home that night frightened out of his wits. First time we had seen him before 9 p.m. since the baby was born. He wanted all the doors and windows shut that night. The next morning, he woke up to all the blinds and windows opened. I had pulled his truck out of the garage and into the front yard so my son could ride his trike. This really put him in a panic. He also wanted the phone off the hook, but somehow it was hung back up. He jumped every time it rang. I actually got my sister to call and hang up several times. The contractor called to thank me and asked if he could do anything to help me. I had one favor to ask. He said with pleasure. When we went to divorce court, my attorney presented all of the evidence collected by the private investigator. My ex had no idea this was coming and his attorney sat down and put his hands over his eyes. What did you find out about your teacher that shocked you? When I was 10 years old, I disappointed my parents so severely that my mom actually told me that she was ashamed of me. We had a new teacher at school, a young and attractive woman who I didn't particularly like. There was a weekly magazine and TV guide that always featured a naked woman who was chosen from readers who sent in their pictures. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Another kid happened to find an old edition of the magazine that featured our new teacher as the weekly babe. We convinced one teacher that another had sent us to make copies of some worksheets, and made about 100 copies of the picture. We distributed them all around the school. The teacher was around 25 years old, and the pictures were taken years earlier, when she was just 17. This wasn't before the internet existed, but it was before it evolved into the black hole of revenge porn and shame that it is today. She had no reason to think that the old picture would come back to haunt her nearly a decade later, and she was shocked and humiliated. When I close my eyes, I can still see my parents' faces the way they looked when they were called to the school and informed of my actions. It was so painfully clear that they couldn't believe I'd let them down like that. Yes, I discovered something shocking about my teacher, and my immature reaction was to share it with the world for my own amusement. It has been more than 21 years, and I swear that writing this is making me turn red with shame.
My entitled stepmother got herself banned from my wedding. My stepmother is a wannabe party planner. She has taken it upon herself to plan and host every party and holiday my dad's family has thrown since she married him. I never loved those occasions growing up as she's controlling and gets upset if people complain about anything, but humored her for my dad's sake. According to him, this helps her feel included. I'm getting married to my fiancée Jane in July. We got engaged in early 2021, but Jane ended up getting pregnant a couple months after that, and we decided to postpone the wedding to focus on our son for a while. So we've had a long engagement. My stepmother has tried to hijack our wedding plans from day one by complaining, contacting our planner, showing up unannounced to Jane's dress appointments, and so on. We have repeatedly asked her to stop. Dad wants us to humor her, but she's clearly resentful of the fact that she's not hosting the wedding or being labeled mother of the groom in invitations. Besides our baby boy, we also have Luke, Jane's paternal half-brother. She got custody of him a few months into our relationship, after his parents died. I ended up moving in with them during the pandemic, and have been in Luke's life since he was a baby. He doesn't call me Dad, but we love him like a son. Stepmother, though, hates Luke. She accuses Jane of baby trapping her way into the family, and that accusation only got worse after our son was born. My dad gets along with Jane and adores the kids, but stepmother demands him to refuse babysitting Luke, so we don't leave the kids with them often. Instead, Jane's brother and sister-in-law usually watch the kids for us, as their children are close to ours in age. We had a thing last Sunday, and my brother-in-law was out of town with his family. Jane's other siblings live in different cities, as well as my mom and sister. My dad agreed to babysit at our place, and we left. We came back to find both kids crying, stepmother screaming, and dad weakly trying to calm everyone down. Apparently, Luke had told stepmother that both he and our son were going to be our ring bearers, and she went ballistic. She screamed that she wasn't going to allow that because he wasn't family. His lip is still split as she went to quiet him down but hit his lip too hard. She'd never gotten to this point before. We immediately banned her from our house and from our wedding. Dad is fuming and has said he's not going without her. He's also convinced half of his side of the family to boycott the wedding as well. This includes my stepbrother, who fully agrees with his mother no matter how many times I try to tell him the truth. Me and Jane are refusing to budge, but many of my cousins who aren't coming anymore are asking us to reconsider. Pretty much all of Jane's family agrees with us, but one of her aunts has suggested that maybe stepmother is acting out because she doesn't feel welcomed by my family.